Good afternoon. I'm Bob Winfield, the Chief Health Officer of the university, and I am really delighted to introduce Professor Ronald Inglehart. Ronald and I have a long history together. Our kids grew up together, and so I've known him in the non-podium format for a long time. Professor Inglehart is actually quite a distinguished scholar and is recognized throughout the world. He has published multiple books just in the last 5 years. He has published Cosmopolitan Communication, Cultural Diversity in the Globalized World, Democratization, Modernization, Culture Change and Democracy, the Human Development Sequence, Sacred and Secular, the Secularization Thesis Revisited, and others. His books have been translated into 16 languages. He is the Lowenstein Professor of Political Science and Research, and a research professor at our Institute of Social Research at the university, and he helped found the Eurobarometer, which surveys and directs the World Values Survey, which has surveyed representative national samples of the public of 97 countries containing almost 90% of the world's population. His research deals with changing belief systems and their impact on social and political change. And today we've asked him to talk about the subject of global happiness, and it's an interesting segue from the power of, from positive psychology, which Dr. Peterson just presented, and where they have co-authored materials together. Dr. Inglehart has also been a visiting professor or visiting scholar in France, Germany, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Brazil, Nigeria, New Zealand, and has been a consultant to the U.S. Department and the U.S. State Department and the European Union. He's been awarded honorary doctorates from two universities, the University of Uppsala, Sweden, and the Free University of Brussels. So I would like to welcome Dr. Inglehart, and I'm sure we will all enjoy and find his discussion very interesting. We'll leave the last 15 minutes for discussion and questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much, Bob. I'd like to add one point. Not only is Bob an old friend via our children who have grown up together, he is my physician. He's kept me healthy and turning out books, and I appreciate that. So for better or for worse, you contributed to these books. It's a pleasure to be here. It was really interesting last night to attend the meeting of the Depression Center, which I had never seen before, and I had this feeling as I walked in, my spontaneous feeling was, this is a really nice building, well designed, and when I got to know the people and the goals and sense the enthusiasm, I had this feeling, this is a well-designed program. I'm pleased to be here. It strikes me as a worthwhile enterprise and a thriving, dynamic one, and I'm delighted to be contributing a little bit to it. I'd like to talk about findings from the World Values Survey, which are quite fascinating. We have data from nearly 100 countries containing 90% of the world's population, so it gives us for the first time, a really pretty comprehensive picture into what goes into happiness. And as you already know, it's complicated. There is the question of how does one attain happiness has been with us for many, many, many years. It goes back to the ancient Greeks, and they had energizing according to perfect virtue and arete and things like that, which I will not dwell on in great length, but my freshman year of college I remember well. And how does one attain happiness in terms of modern social science and biological science? There are prevailing views. One widely accepted view is the set point model, that people have a set point that is largely genetically determined. Changes for the better or for the worse can happen. They can bring short-term fluctuations, but in the long run, people return to a set point. There is evidence from twin studies that supports this. Identical twins raised together or separately, etc., have highly correlated happiness levels, even when one's in Columbus, Ohio, and the other's in Bismarck, North Dakota. And I find it convincing. I think there clearly is something to this, I believe. But I don't think this is the whole story. And one flaw of these studies is that they're all carried out within given countries. That is, genetic factors may have a big impact on explaining the variation in happiness within the U.S. But we find huge variation between happiness levels of different societies, as we'll see. I think unless we assume that the Danes and the Italians have basically different genetic structures from Americans, which I don't think the evidence points that way, this suggests that it can't all be due to genetic factors. Cultural, historical, and institutional factors linked with living in Denmark versus living in the U.S. seem to make a large difference, quite a large difference, and I'll talk about these today. The genetic set point, of course, implies that neither individuals nor societies can change their level of subjective well-being, and there's some evidence of this, some of which I have provided over long-term surveys. One of the things that I found early on, and repeated surveys have shown this, these are data over a period from 1973 to into the 2000s of happiness levels, or in this case life satisfaction levels, of different nationalities, and they're pretty stable. The Danes are always way up there. This is a finding that is replicated. These findings are from the Eurobarometer surveys that have gone on every spring and every fall for years and years. And not only these surveys, but the Gallup World Poll and the European Social Survey, more or less everyone who studies it finds the Danes are a happy people. I'd like to tell you why this is true, but actually we don't have time today. Let's just say there are a variety of conditions that the Danes are lucky people. I think this is a real finding. I don't think this is a fluke of translation. Actually, I've dug into flukes of translation questions, and the results, though it is perfectly plausible that glücklich means something different from happy, or zufrieden means something different from satisfied, actually, Switzerland is a nice counter example of this, because the Swiss, speaking German, French, and Italian, have high happiness levels consistently, much higher than those of the Germans, the French, or the Italians. The Swiss are also relatively happy people. And this is, again, I have ideas about why this is so, but we won't have time for that today. Let's simply say there are some nationalities that are much higher on happiness and life satisfaction stably. This is a relatively stable attribute of given societies. It is not, however, something that seems to be genetically determined. First of all, I don't think anyone in this room, well, let's say, I think it unlikely, and I think if you delve into the evidence, it's quite clear this is not a plausible interpretation. The Danes have a happiness gene that differs from the Portuguese, who are consistently fairly low in European perspective. There are no known genetic differences linked with happiness that are prevalent in Denmark and not in Portugal. It seems to be social, cultural, institutional. Being a democracy is conducive to happiness. That's one of the findings which political factors enter into it, and there is a surprisingly strong linkage between happiness and democracy. Jumping way ahead of the story, that's an interesting and rather surprising, completely non-obvious finding, and it seems to work in both directions. I would say that happy people are more likely to sustain democracy. They tend to be trusting, tolerant, have a positive attitude, be cooperative, etc., which is conducive to democracy. But also, democracy provides freedom, and freedom is conducive to happiness. A sense of control over your life is conducive to happiness. Quite significantly, it's a strong predictor of happiness. This is not going to surprise you, but let's say it is non-obvious. It's not a priori obvious. Freedom is important to happiness. A sense of choosing your destiny and being able to choose your destiny, to live your life your way, is conducive to happiness. So this is one reason why the Danes are up there, but it's more complicated. Evidence from the World Values Survey suggests that belief systems play a major role in shaping happiness, and that they contribute to rising or falling happiness levels in entire societies. And one hint that these are not genetic is Belgium. If you look closely, you can see this one double line which starts out at about 45 on the left, goes down to about 20 on the right. During the past few decades, Belgium had a dramatic decline in satisfaction and happiness, satisfaction with your life as a whole. I don't think the Belgian gene pool changed dramatically in these 30 years. There was something going on in Belgium, and in fact, this decline in subjective well-being preceded real troubles. Belgium went through a time when it broke up from being a unitary state to a federal state where the Flemish-speaking and the French-speaking people went their separate ways to an increasing degree. There were various scandals and other things which, again, it's lovely to go into the details of these countries, but we don't have time. Let's say Belgium had hard times, and the declining happiness preceded the political restructuring. So this is not just, it's interesting to know what people are happy and what are not. In fact, this is a leading indicator of when happiness levels go down, as they did in Belgium. It preceded a major restructuring of Belgian politics, and even more dramatically, in Russia, subjective well-being levels fell dramatically before the Soviet Union came apart. So these are interesting in themselves. We are all interested in what is conducive to happiness. It has political implications back and forth, linked with democracy. The causal directions seem to be reciprocal, but strongly linked with democracy, linked with when subjective well-being goes down dramatically. Usually it's quite stable. Mostly the pattern is the lines are very flat over 30 years. When they're not flat over 30 years, something important's happening. And in terms of linkage with depression, I would say that when, for a there are crises which happen in individuals and in societies where things get really grim. It is unusual that this happens for societies, but it does happen. Happened in Belgium, it happened in the Soviet Union, where happiness and subjective well-being levels went way down, remained down below to levels unprecedented, to levels that one had never seen before. And I would say there were surely massive levels of depression in Russia, probably today to some extent, although it's recovering. But in the 1990s, from the collapse of the Soviet Union on, there was a good decade of what I would say was widespread depression. I think that if you had been studying it, you would have found massive clinical depression among the Russian people, contributing to their turning to Vladimir Putin as a savior to bring them out of the mess they were in, because they were indeed in a mess. So this is evidence from the World Value Surveys suggests that belief systems play a major role in shaping happiness. They can contribute to falling or rising happiness levels in entire societies. I would love to tell you that it's all belief systems, because then I could tell you, believe this, I've got this list of 20 points, adopt these beliefs and you're going to be happy. It's not that simple. It's an interplay between objective conditions, which were rotten in the ex-Soviet Union, crime, everything broke down. GNP per capita fell to 40% its former level. There was a breakdown of order. There was crime. The welfare state wasn't working. Life expectancy fell. Male life expectancy particularly, because there was widespread, massive alcohol abuse. In my visits to Russia and to the Soviet Union in the old days, to Russia, more recently, I am continually under pressure. A good guy's real men drink until they fall under the table. I resist this for various reasons, and they'd laugh at me. Finally, they got, Inglehart's just not a real party boy. And the truth is that many of my colleagues who would be urging me to drink until I fall under the table are dead now. Male life expectancy in Russia has fallen to the level where it's about at the level of Central Africa. Alcohol abuse is a real problem. Anyway, belief systems matter. And this, I think, has been underestimated. Belief systems matter. It's complicated. I do not have one belief system. I wish I did. I'd hand out pamphlets probably if I did. It's kind of complicated, but belief systems do matter. They have an impact, but it's an interaction between external conditions and how you assess these, how you react to the external conditions. I don't have any magic solution for solving the massive problems that Russia experienced, but it's partly you can be happy by getting what you like or by liking what you get. The liking what you get has an impact on it too. So it's society's institutions and belief systems become more important at developmental levels. Next point is significant. One of my early findings that was quite fascinating was the people of rich countries are happier than the people of poor countries. This, again, was not at all obvious. The early findings were all based on data from rich countries, which were the only places that did surveys. And among rich countries, there was no correlation between GNP per capita and happiness. Ireland, for reasons that I can imagine, is an overachiever. Even back in the days when the 1960s, when the earliest surveys were being done, Ireland showed higher happiness levels than Germany, though Germany had a twice as high a GNP per capita. This seemed to prove economic development is not conducive to happiness. When we got data from the World Values Survey, it became evident that's not true. In fact, we find a 0.65 correlation between GNP per capita and subjective well-being if we include the whole range of countries. If we include Burkina Faso and Nigeria and Mali and Thailand, we have a much wider range, and the desperate subsistence level poverty societies have much lower happiness levels than the rich ones. This again, when I tell you this, it's not going to make your jaws drop. After the fact, it's obvious, but in fact there was for some years, an established belief that economic development is uncorrelated with happiness. Actually it is, but it's curvilinear. As this regression line here suggests, there's a curvilinear relationship where escaping desperate poverty, where your children die in their first year and you don't know where your next meal is coming from, which is true of much of humanity today and has been true of most of humanity, most of history. Escaping from that is a good feeling. It won't surprise you, but it's true. Escaping from desperate poverty is conducive to happiness. But above a certain level, roughly Portugal, South Korea, or in that area, it doesn't make much difference anymore. The curve levels off, and there are still significant differences between the happiness levels of different societies, but it's linked with their institutions and belief systems more than with GNP per capita. More and more belief systems, lifestyle enter in, and they become more significant factors. And of course, this is interesting because you can do something about belief systems and institutions. And I will zero in on specific belief systems and institutions. I've already hinted democracy. This is, as a political scientist at the University of Michigan, I'm almost honor-bound to say democracy is a good system. Actually, if I didn't think it, I wouldn't. But the evidence is pretty clear. Democracy is linked with happiness. So whether you think it is good in other ways, it may bumble around and debate endlessly and stuff, but it is linked with a feeling of happiness. So that in this respect, at least, I would say it gets high marks. But it's not just that. If we look at this map, if you're in the front rows, you probably can see it better. All of the Latin American countries, there are 13, they're all above the regression line. That is, they have higher subjective well-being levels than their GNP per capita would predict. All of the ex-communist countries, with two exceptions, are below the regression line. And we've got, 17 or 18 of them. They're all below the regression line. They are roughly, their economic level is comparable to that of Latin America, but the Latin Americans are 2 or 3 times as likely to say they are very happy or very satisfied with their lives. It's a significant finding. The two exceptions are China and Vietnam, which are officially still communist. The others are ex-communist, where the belief system has collapsed. China and Vietnam are a little above the regression line. They are countries where officially they're still communist and they're experiencing high growth rates, and I don't think it is communist ideology makes you unhappy. It's more complicated than that. I would say the collapse of communism makes you unhappy. Communism once was a belief system that provided a sense of meaning and purpose to millions of people, and you cannot possibly understand the success of the Chinese Communist Revolution or of the Bolshevik Revolution without an awareness that this once was a belief system that people would give their lives for. People dedicated their lives to it, gave their lives for it in another era. There was an era in the U.S. when, in the 30s and somewhat into the 40s, when American intellectuals were attracted to communism because capitalism seemed to be failing, etc. It once was a belief system that was vital. It seemed to be an alternative to the traditional religious, seemingly outmoded value system of religion on one hand, and the capitalist model seemed to have failed in the Great Depression, largely discredited. Communism once was a positive force, contributing to people's sense their lives were meaningful. And I think, I don't have survey data from the 30s, 40s, 50s, but I strongly suspect that in that era, communist beliefs were not negatively linked with happiness. Today, in any case, whether that's a right or wrong guess, today it's quite clear they are. The collapse of communism brought all kinds of bad things, declining material well-being, declining order, but also, I would say, the collapse of a belief system was very important. It's not just that they suffered economically, because, in fact, Russia, after the collapse of communism, went to low levels of subjective well-being, far below much poorer countries like Nigeria. It was unplumbed depths where there was, for some time, a literature explaining why it is that you always get a positive bias. When you ask people, how happy are you, you always get above the midpoint. When life satisfaction scales, you're always above the midpoint. Generally, people tend to say, oh, I'm very happy or reasonably happy. They don't often say not very happy. In the former Soviet Union, the majority of the people by 1995 toward 2000 were saying, I am unhappy or very unhappy. It was, most people describe themselves as unhappy. This was dramatic, unprecedented, and I think a real phenomenon. It explains some of the things that were going on, such as xenophobia, etc., and a swing toward authoritarianism. This was a big event. Summing up what I've said, all Latin American societies are overachievers, and virtually all the ex-communist countries are underachievers, showing lower levels of subjective well-being than their economic level would predict. As mentioned, China and Vietnam are a little above the regression line, but they are not collapsed communist societies. They're societies where no one really believes in communism anymore, but it's not a widely discredited ideology. In fact, nominally, we're all communists, we just don't practice it. And where they're quite prosperous. And the prosperity, as mentioned earlier, is a payoff, especially when you're moving from desperate starvation-level poverty, as China and Vietnam have been doing, to a reasonable level of prosperity. This is good news. This is a positive experience that has led to rising levels of happiness and well-being. Our indicators are life satisfaction and self-reported happiness. They go together fairly closely. They're the most sensitive of dozens of indicators that have been used. And, the adherents of the set point interpretation dismiss findings of cross-national differences by arguing that happiness has a different meaning in these societies. It's a translation problem. That doesn't hold up in longitudinal perspective because, in fact, we find big changes. The collapse of communism, we've got only two countries for which we had survey data from before the collapse of communism through 1990 and on into the 2000s. And Russia and Hungary both showed dramatic declines in subjective well-being. Russia more than Hungary. Russia's experience was more severe than that of Hungary, but they both showed dramatic declines. There was no change in translation. We were still using the Hungarian word for happiness and the Russian word for life satisfaction, and the responses changed a lot. The differences are real. They reflect reality, and it is not dreadfully surprising. Having studied the recent experience of these countries is not surprising, and of course, you would not find it really surprising that collapse of your economy and your society and your political system and your belief system is linked with misery. It's not a big surprise. Latin America is actually a bit more surprising. The empirical evidence is robust. Survey after survey shows it. And it is not, again, translation, because the Spaniards, or the Portuguese, speaking the same languages, don't show these overachiever levels. Something in Latin American society, and again, we don't have time to go into the details. I have ideas about it, but let's say you're lucky to be Latin American in some ways. They are not the best governed or richest countries in the world, but they have relatively high levels of subjective well-being, and I think I will just pass on. It's a combination, very capsule summary, superficial capsule summary is, these countries are characterized by a relatively strong sense of national pride, strong religious beliefs, which are part of the story, only part, and a relatively strong feeling that people are in control of their lives. Latin Americans feel they have free choice, they control their lives, and this accounts for anomalously high levels of happiness. The free choice in how to live one's life has a major impact on human happiness. This is one of the rather dramatic findings. The past 25 years have been up to 2008. My data end in 2007. I would expect the last years have not been conducive to rising levels of happiness. Economic collapse is, I would expect, linked with declining subjective well-being. But 25 years up to 2007, and including 2007, were years of first massive democratization. Dozens of countries democratized during this period, and this is linked, as I've said, to a surprisingly strong degree, rising levels of well-being. The other thing which is underestimated, but the empirical data makes it very strongly clear, social tolerance is linked with happiness. Tolerant people are happier. It is an interesting finding that not only within tolerant societies have higher levels of happiness than intolerant societies, and within given societies. Living in a tolerant society makes everyone happier. Living in a tolerant society like Sweden raises the level of even the less tolerant people. So there's a kind of general feeling it's more comfortable, less stress, less hostility, less anxiety. Living in a tolerant society is linked with subjective well-being. There are various indicators of tolerance. Gender equality is a good one. This applies to half the population, and societies that are big on gender equality are quite significantly happier than societies that are low on gender equality. That is, both subjective attitudes toward gender equality and objective, they go together to a remarkable degree. These attitudes are linked with and precede social changes. For example, over a long period of time, Sweden has experienced a trend toward rising emphasis on gender equality in terms of subjective attitudes. This preceded changes that have brought Sweden to having 43% of the members of parliament are women, and a large number of cabinet ministers are women. The objective gender equality tends to go with subjective, but it is not that the objective conditions create the attitudes. It seems to be that in terms of gender roles at least, changing values precede the changing societal characteristics. Similarly, changing value systems are part of a gradual intergenerational change that preceded the wave of democratization around 1990, when dozens of countries shifted from authoritarian to democratic systems. Cultural change is a leading indicator of social political change. And rising tolerance of gender equality is linked with tolerance of social diversity, tolerance of ethnic minorities, foreigners, gays and lesbians. At this point in history, tolerance of gays and lesbians is a particularly good indicator of social tolerance exactly because it is the least tolerated group. It's a group that in our first survey in 1981, we had a 10-point scale. Is homosexuality never justifiable, 0.1, up to 0.10, always justifiable. In our first wave of surveys, very unusual. If you've used 10-point scales, you usually get normal distribution, more or less, of most of the people in the middle. On this one, we got 51% of the sample at point 1, and the rest of the sample at points 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Very little tolerance for gays and lesbians. That's the bad news. The good news is it's changing. It has changed dramatically so that in our most recent survey, only about 25% of the population is at point 1. It's not high tolerance, but quite a significant change. Rising tolerance of homosexuality, which is one of many indications in developed societies, not everywhere, but in developed societies linked with development, linked with rising sense of security, people have been becoming more tolerant. There's been, though we are far from utopia, last 25 years have seen significant trends toward rising tolerance of gays and lesbians, rising tolerance of ethnic minorities, rising support for gender equality, and this is linked with changes in rising happiness. Here are some of the time series data about when jobs are scarce, more men have more right to a job than women. Throughout advanced industrial societies, there's been a significant shift from almost 30% agreeing with this in 4 West European countries in 1990 to only a little over 15%. In the US, it's even a more dramatic change. It's about half as many people in the 2000 survey agreed as in the earlier surveys. Attitudes of homosexuality have shown similar changes, rising tolerance from very low levels of tolerance, but rather substantial changes over time. This has broadened people's sense of freedom, contributing to a rising sense of happiness. Since 1981, happiness has increased in 45 of the 50 societies for which a substantial time series is available. In other words, again, this is contrary to a widely accepted finding that happiness levels are constant. These findings are mostly based on the US, for which we have by far the most survey data, way more than any other country, and goes back to 1945, and it's been flat in the US since about 1945, which has led to the expectation that this is true of all countries. It's not. It is, the US is actually very much a deviant case, and I'd say in retrospect, 1945 was a lovely baseline time when we had just won World War II. The guys were coming back from a crusade in which good had triumphed over evil. The US was producing about half of the world's gross national product. It was the sole nuclear power kingpin of the universe. Everything was good. And then we had Vietnam and so on, and eras of, though things got tougher, we were going, this time series starts at a remarkably high level. I would say probably one of the golden moments of American history, and didn't rise much. 2 reasons for this. First of all, it started at a high level. If we'd started in 1932, I strongly suspect it would have been getting out of the Great Depression to 1946 would have shown a rise. I don't have any data, this is my guess, but I strongly suspect that starting in the Great Depression, we would have seen a different picture. But we didn't start in the Great Depression, we started in the glorious triumph over evil, and the US at the top of the world. And in any case, whether this guess is right or not, the US is not typical. This flat time series for the US is not typical of the world as a whole. In fact, from 1981 to 2007, happiness increased in 45 of the 50 serious societies for which a substantial time series is available. Here's the data, and at the top are countries like Nigeria and France and South Africa and Argentina. At the bottom, China and Taiwan. Okay, and this is not everywhere, but in most countries, and I think it's a combination of, I don't argue that happiness is increasing always forever. This would be very naive. This was an atypical era. This was rather a golden era. From 1981 to 2007, there was massive economic growth. The world as a whole, the US, modest economic growth, but the 1990s were jolly for the US, but for the world as a whole, including China and India, highest economic growth in recorded history. The poor countries were escaping poverty. 40% of the world was going from subsistence level poverty to a modest level of security. Big point. In addition, during this era, dozens of countries democratized. This was a big factor too. In addition, this was, as we've just documented, an era of rising social tolerance which contributed to. A lot of good things were going on. I would say the era since 2008 has not been equally positive. I would not anticipate that all the signs were up, but the point is not that happiness will always increase. There's nothing automatic about it. During this era, however, when conditions were favorable, happiness did increase for most countries. So this was, even the US went up a little. This was, it of course contradicts the implications of the genetic set point model. I don't think anyone believes there was a genetic shift in this very short period of time. I'd say there's convincing evidence, I find it quite convincing, that genetic factors play an important role, but they're only part of the story. I think we need to pay more attention to belief systems and institutions, and this is the story. The democratization is part of it. In many of the new democracies, democratization, however, was accompanied by economic, political, and social collapse, so it was not automatically linked with rising happiness. In the former Soviet Union, democratization went up, peaking in 1995 when most people felt that Russia was a democratic country, and then in the subsequent era under Vladimir Putin, declining, rising authoritarianism. Today, no expert coder would rank Russia as a democracy. Happiness did not rise with democratization. As you can see, when democracy was soaring, happiness was going down a bit and only began to recover when, under Putin, and particularly because rising oil prices, Russia regained prosperity. So, does politics alone determine happiness? Clearly not. Other factors, collapse of the economy and collapse of the belief system, more than offset the benefits of democratization. In other societies, such as Mexico, democratization was not linked with economic collapse. In fact, it was linked with a rise in happiness, and Mexico had significant rise in happiness linked with, coinciding with the transition to democracy around 2000, when there's this fairly big jump from 1995 to 2000, exactly the year when they made the first transition to somebody other than the PRI, the Party of the Institutionalized Revolution, was able to win an election. This transition to democratic institutions in Mexico was linked with a significant and apparently persisting rise in happiness. Same thing in South Korea. Democratization went with a modest increase in happiness. It was, the democratization occurred in 1995 or in the mid-90s, and significant increase, well actually 1990 was democratization, and happiness has been a bit higher. I'd like to wind up with a couple of paradoxes about the role of religion. Within most countries, lower income groups are more religious than higher income groups, and religion is much stronger in low income countries than in high income countries. There's a negative 4 or 5 correlation. And finally, happiness has a strong correlation with GNP per capita. This is a 0.6 to 0.7 correlation, quite a strong one. This implies religious people must be less happy than non-religious people. In spite of this, we find that within most countries, people with strong religious beliefs are happier than those who place little or no emphasis on religion. And this is interesting. Most countries by far are to the right of the line. This is a graph of positive correlations. The vertical axis is the zero correlation, and as you move to the right, you get strong correlations between religious people are happier. As you move to the left, religious people are less happy. I wish we had bigger print here, but take my word for it unless you're in the front row. Most of the exceptions are ex-communist countries. There are countries where religious people are less happy, but nearly all of them are Russia, Hungary, Slovenia, Romania, Lithuania, Belarus, Bulgaria, Moldova, Vietnam, Macedonia, China, Albania, Montenegro, Nigeria too, but only weakly. Mostly the exceptional countries are ex-communist, where exactly what's happening, I believe, is the collapse of the communist belief system has opened up an ideological vacuum where people are flocking to religion. And indeed they are. There's rising emphasis on religion in Russia and China and other ex-communist countries. What's happening here is unhappy people are moving to religion, creating a negative correlation between religion, religiosity, and happiness. Long established countries where religion's been around for a long time, like the US or Iceland or Canada, show relatively strong correlations between religion and happiness. Okay, one route to happiness is religion. I'd say this has been a traditional route to happiness that has been very important. For most of history, people had no opportunities for democracy, economic growth, social tolerance. Conditions were grim, and religion provided a sense of purpose, reassurance that things were going to work out. It contributed to happiness. There is a traditional route to happiness, and, just confirming my claim about what's happening, the importance of God in people's lives rose in ex-communist societies and developing countries, but decreased in most developed societies. This is a graph of where the importance of God increased toward the right or decreased toward the left. Despite claims of a worldwide resurgence of religion, it's not that simple. Religion is rising in some countries and declining in others, and in most rich countries it's declining. It's been declining over recent years. What's happened is an increasing salience of religious fundamentalists, not that they are becoming the majority group. This is misleading, but in some countries, particularly ex-communist countries, Bulgaria, Romania, Russia, China are at the top of this graph, where subjective importance of God has increased most. So, on one hand, I would say religion is moving in to fill an ideological vacuum in the short run at least, and I can't say what will happen in the long run, but for now, creating this negative correlation on happy people are becoming religious, but this is one component. Religion has traditionally been an important sense support for well-being. There is a different and in some ways antithetical shift in developed societies that are moving toward increased gender equality, gays, foreigners, and outgroups, more emphasis on individual autonomy and freedom of choice, increasing emphasis on self-expression and political liberalization, and democratic institutions. This is a modern route where greater autonomy, freedom of choice are another route to happiness. So I don't have a simple solution, but I'd say this has broadened people's sense of freedom, contributed to rising happiness, and as we've seen, rising happiness in most countries. There's convincing evidence that genetic factors play an important role, but they're only part of the story, and these various trends, cultural changes toward greater social tolerance are leading to rising levels of human happiness. At this point, I'd like to invite questions and comments or cries of outrage.
We have about 10 minutes left, and if you'd like to step up to a microphone or pass in a card, we'll be collecting questions. And I'd like to start off with a question. Could you mention a little bit more about the United States and what's been happening over the last 20 or 30 years, the biggest determinants of happiness here?
The United States has had a traumatic period. I suggested that the flatness of subjective well-being in the U.S. reflects the fact that the time series just happens to start at a golden point, the 1946 when we were on top of the world. And there was a real dip linked with the Vietnam era of severe questioning of the national mission, a generational conflict, a dip from about the Vietnam era to the present. There's been a modest increase in subjective well-being, I would say linked with rising social tolerance, democratization, and so on. But the U.S. has been, in the last couple of decades, has actually had a modest rise. The long-term trend from 1946 is flat, but this conceals a sort of dip linked with the Vietnam era when the country was tearing itself apart and then a modest recovery since that era when things have gotten better and there is a rising sense of well-being. The U.S. is kind of a deviant case in that it doesn't show much change. So I don't have huge explanatory factors for the U.S. If the U.S. had democratized for the first time, that'd be dramatic. The U.S. already was relatively advanced in gender equality and has had significant increase in social tolerance, which I think have been contributing to the modest rise in subjective well-being. Okay, how does a greater connection with religion equal greater freedom? It doesn't. It is an alternative. There are two routes, I would say, to rising social subjective well-being. One of them linked with an era when people had very little personal autonomy and very little freedom of choice, when surrendering to a higher power, having a sense that though you might starve and your children might die in the next year, it was in the hands of a benevolent higher power, and if you prayed and did right, it would work out. That was a very different, in an era when there wasn't much personal choice. It was very narrow choice. Your fate was largely outside your control. Modern societies have brought greatly increased freedom of choice. People have more resources. They can choose careers. Women, for example, once had be a wife and mother, which was the mainline alternative for the vast majority, or a nun or a prostitute, very small niches. That was it. Today, women can have more or less any career open to men. They have a much broader range of choice. Gays and lesbians have a far broader range of choice in how to live their lives. Democracy gives people freedom to travel, freedom of speech. So freedom of choice, I would say, is linked with happiness. It's not the only route to happiness. People are creative and in pre-modern eras worked out ways to adapt to the absence of freedom in ways that were relatively tolerable, and they survived.
How long does it take for an individual leaving a society or family to adapt to a new society and new levels of happiness? So if you have people leaving someplace like Cambodia or Vietnam and they come to the United States, how long does it take for that change to affect?
To a large extent, it's a generational change. People tend to be formed by the time they reach adulthood. They tend to have an outlook that is pretty fixed for most of their life. Anything can happen, but by and large, people don't change much past reaching adult years. The generational change is rather dramatic, and again, it depends on the conditions. The more the people are inserted in and assimilated to the society, the more the change happens. But it's interesting that to some extent we can still see traces of different levels of happiness in people from different origins that correlate fairly well with the happiness levels of their societies of origin. This is a persisting influence that tends to dilute, but it's fairly lasting.
I have two almost identical questions. Both ask about the issue of democracy versus social democracies, such as are represented in Canada. Are social democracies happier than straightforward democracies that aren't considered social democracies?
This takes us back to Denmark. Yes is the short answer to that question, and a little more complicated is social democracies, that is, societies with high levels of social solidarity and tolerance and so on, like Sweden, Denmark, are happier than the United States. The U.S. is rich and powerful. It is not the happiest society in the world. It's interesting, I've presented findings, and sometimes journalists ask indignantly, why isn't the U.S. number one? Well, we're actually 16 out of 90 societies. 16 isn't bad, but it's not the top of the pack. It is, out of 90 societies, in the top minority, but the U.S. is a bit of an underachiever because Though it has a high GNP per capita, it is less reliably, equally distributed. There is less social equality, there are more social tensions, more competition, less security. In the US, and I didn't mention this, but the Nordic countries are all overachievers. There are two groups of countries that are overachievers. Latin America, which is dramatic. They are not rich countries, but high on subjective well-being. The Nordic countries are even a little higher. They're right up there. And, you know, it's complicated, but I would say the fact that they have advanced welfare states and high levels of tolerance and solidarity is probably linked with this.
Many of you know that Bhutan has instead of a gross national product, they have a gross national happiness index. The question is, what do you know about the effect of the government's active role in promoting happiness in countries like Bhutan that have been tracked?
Well, I have no data from Bhutan. I don't think they do, or at least I'm not aware of, any empirical measurement of happiness levels. They do indeed have a government that is admirably dedicated toward maximizing gross national happiness rather than gross national product. Maybe the best thing to do is just say, I don't know.
Fair enough. Here's another one you may not know, but it's interesting and timely. Is there a relationship between universal health care and happiness?
Yes. This is, I can show you the statistics. The universal health care is linked with higher, it's part of this package whereby the Nordic countries are overachievers. They're not richer than the US, but they're happier.
All right, and I think this will probably have to be our last question. What do you predict will happen or is happening to levels of happiness with respect to the economic downturn in the U.S. And a recovery?
I would love to have a crystal ball. My belief is we're recovering, but along with many others, I don't really know. Let's say this is a big question. The evidence I've presented suggests that economic security is part, not the whole story, part of the package. It's especially important for low-income countries. Less important for rich countries, but even there it has some role. Thus, I would expect that the economic downturn would depress subjective well-being levels. I think it would have more impact on poor countries than on rich countries, and it depends on how protracted the crisis is. If it's short and we're pulling out now after just a couple of years, I don't think it's going to have a big impact. But if we are on the brink of the Great Depression of the 21st century, then I would expect a downturn.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.